Golera Cordia August Foil Road. Welcome to be my guest with me, Mary Honan, on Lear Media TV, supporting the Samaritans, Limerick and Tipperary, Clare's Wish Foundation in Limerick, and Deal Animal Rescue in West Limerick. And my wonderful guest today, even though he's been described as being the controversial priest, is Fr Iggy O'Donovan from the Glen of Aherlow originally from the Glen of Aherlow in Tipperary. Hello, Father.
Hello, how are you?
I'm grand. Do you prefer to be called Father or Iggy?
Iggy will do fine. I've been called worse.
We won't call you anything.
Yeah, okay.
Does that sit well with you that I saw a lot of posts, controversial priest with controversial views. Do you consider yourself controversial?
I don't really. I've had the most traditional upbringing. I come from a family of 10, the foot of the Galties. We were brought up in very traditional Catholicism and family rosaries and all that type of thing. I joined a very traditional religious order, the Augustinians.
Yeah.
And my whole formation later was in theology, and that was in Rome. Especially during the pontificate of John Paul II. Hardly the most radical of times to be in Rome. But,
Pope John Paul was conservative.
Yes, well, I must say I've met two officially canonized saints in my time, John Paul and Mother Teresa. Yes.
Yeah, jeepers. I mean,
yes.
What was it like? Now, I didn't think you were going to go down that route, but what was it like when you met both of them, actually, but Mother Teresa? Did you meet her
Well,
first?
Obviously, on both occasions, it would have been sort of a fleeting moment, if you know what I mean. There would have been other people present and they shook your hand. But I did have supper with a group of people with John Paul once in 1982. I remember he was still quite active and then going well. And he came to supper one evening at the Augustinian headquarters in Rome, and I was one of the guests. And I still recall he having a glass of red wine and an orange. And that was his meal for the evening.
That was a strange red wine and an orange.
Well, somebody said to him, one of the people at the table, I remember an old Spanish brother said to him, Holy Father, if you don't eat something, you'll have to raid the fridge when you get back to the Vatican. And John Paul, I remember, said in Italian, I don't eat much in the evening. So he sipped a little red wine and nibbled at an orange. That's my memory.
It was probably better off. Sometimes I don't think anybody probably, they say, should eat past 6 o'clock in the evening. So probably.
Yeah. Well, this would have been.
Would have
been 9 o'clock.
Sorry.
This would have been 9 o'clock actually. At the end of the day.
He was a very fit man, and he was a very sport orientated man all his life. So maybe that health carried through all his life. That he was. But Father Iggy, at one stage you baptized. I remember reading about it. You baptized a child, and you allowed the godparents pour water over the baby's head. And you caused massive controversy within the.
Actually, it was not so much the godparents, but the parents.
Yeah, why was that such a big deal? Such that the parents were written to, the parents were contacted, and the baby had to be rebaptized. And
rebaptizing somebody is in fact heretical. It is heretical. You can only be baptized once. Even if you're baptized by a Muslim or by a pagan or by an unbeliever, baptism is valid. Okay? Yeah. So in that case, the parish priest in question rebaptized because the man didn't have a theological brain cell between his ears. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done that.
Your face is
And
Big
I
Father
take
Green.
my great hero of the ancient church, which Augustine, who is regarded as possibly the greatest mind in our theological history. One of his very strong points was you never rebaptize. Never.
I know
It is
of,
there once, he says, and
I know of situations.
actually what happened in this case, it was political. There was a group out that decided that this was a way of pulling the carpet from beneath me, and they succeeded. As they have with anybody who has questioned the system. Really, yes.
You have tried. You were moved after that. You were actually
Yes.
moved after that, weren't you? How did
Yeah,
that?
to Limerick.
How did that
To
sit?
Limerick of all places.
But how? Yeah, well, I mean, there's always positives. You were moved to Limerick. I mean,
Yes, Limerick. Yes.
you know, that's almost, I suppose, like a promotion for you when you were moved to Limerick.
Well, I got on okay in Limerick, actually. And
Why
I
wouldn't
was
you?
near a bit. Yeah. But it wasn't so much where I was moved to as the fact that one was moved because of that, which sort of shows the narrowness and the bigotry and the way things were done. I mean, it was appalling, really. But
Well, can I just say, I know of people and of situations where grandparents or parents were worried about grandchildren who weren't baptized or weren't going to be baptized, and actually
yes,
took it upon themselves to actually baptize the child in the
yes,
case because they were actually scared stiff and they knew that the parents were against the baptism. And
yes,
that, and from my meager knowledge, that would be considered a baptism. That child would be baptized.
yes,
So
yes,
she was baptized by a Catholic priest. She was baptized with the sign of the cross, and she was baptized into the Catholic Church in good faith.
yeah.
Why was it so? Do you think it was wholly political and a way of getting rid of you?
Well, obviously, it could have nothing to do with theology. It could have nothing to do with the sacrament. It couldn't. I mean, Christ himself wasn't baptized by a Catholic priest. He was baptized by John the Baptist, who was a Jew. And so, therefore, if Christ's baptism was valid, this one should have been.
And what did the family think? I mean, I know they were outraged when they
They
found
were.
out that they
They
had
were.
they had no idea that what was going on in the background.
No,
And
they went along with what the parish priest told them to do. They told me later if they had realized what was happening, they wouldn't have gone along. But they went along with what he told them to do. And, you know, people, for better or for worse, we've always in this country gone along with what parish priests told us, and not always in the wisest way. But what's done is done.
ask you on, they say there are people who are probably, well, I suppose you also were very outspoken when it came to the equality referendum.
Yes, yes, yes.
And voting for same-sex marriage. And you said that you were going to vote yes in the referendum.
Yes.
And that, as we know, goes against the pillars of the Catholic Church's ethos on marriage. Why
Yes.
do you feel so compelled to vote yes in the referendum, given that you are a theological priest, you're a theologian, you're a priest, you're an Augustinian, and you're devoted, as you say, to the Catholic Church? Why?
Yes.
Why do you find the rules of the Catholic? I'm asking now because I'm putting the questions that other people might be thinking. Why are you so opposed to following rules of the church that you actually joined because of those rules, probably?
No, I'm actually keeping to the rules of the church that I joined. I am actually keeping to the rules. It's just that in voting in a referendum, I was voting as an Irish citizen.
Yeah.
For my fellow citizens. And while I believe in Catholic marriage and so forth, I see this, and other people see this, as a matter of civil rights for other citizens who don't happen to believe what I believe. So I will keep my Catholic beliefs, I will support them, but I will respect other people who have different views and are equally passionately held as mine, as
Yes.
fellow citizens.
Yes, but
I was
there are
voting in purely secular matter. It was a legal secular matter. It had nothing to do with my personal faith at all, which I still hold on to.
but
But
there are people, Father, who would ask you the question by voting the way you did, being that you are an Augustinian and a priest, that you are voting against what you have, what the priesthood would teach, and what the Catholic Church would teach, and therefore you're leaving the church open for to be, in some senses, well, you know, if the church can change on this, they can change on that. And what are the, you know, all our lives we were told you can't take the communion from the top of your mouth because it's a sin. The prayers
yeah,
are constantly changing, and you're there and you're saying to yourself, there doesn't seem to be. And a friend of mine, her husband, who's Muslim, said to me, what the difference between why our church, he said, is so strong and why the Catholic Church is failing, he said, is because you don't have strict foundations and rules. He said, our teachings are the same from day one to now, and we follow the teachings rather than the teachings following us and trying to bend to our will rather than we following, rather than the church becoming a strong foundational parent, if you like, that you have to follow the rules within the household. It's like the parent is giving way to the child all the time. So what would you say to people who would say that you're helping by doing that, by going against the church, you're helping to weaken the church or the teachings of the church?
but I would repeat that I have not gone against the teaching of the church. I hold on to the teaching of the church on marriage and so forth. I'm simply we were voting on a constitutional matter.
Yeah.
And I was simply recognizing my fellow citizens who have a view different to mine and who see this as a civil right. I mightn't see it that way, but they do. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to keep my teaching, but I will not impose on other people something they don't wish to believe or don't follow. If the Muslims think that should be done, and mind you, most Muslim societies are probably in the most intolerant places on earth. You go through any one of them. For example, there's not a Muslim democracy in the world, anywhere. As bad as we are, we have some form of democracy.
Yeah.
So that I don't take the Muslims as being the ideal situation for anybody in almost any sense of the term, and certainly not when it comes to do with civil rights or rights of anybody.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, I'm just, I suppose, being devil's advocate here, because we
Yeah.
have to, I suppose, produce a balanced approach to this. But in the case of the Catholic Church, if somebody wanted to get married, do you believe in marriage being for everybody within the Catholic Church, or just as a structure within the legal system within our constitution and within the country? But what would happen now, you know, for instance, with same-sex couples wanting to marry within the Catholic Church? Would you be opposed or for?
The same-sex marriage within the Catholic Church doesn't happen. You can't do it. It's not a Catholic marriage. I accept that. But for those who wish to have same-sex marriage outside the Catholic Church, I don't see it as my role to prevent them.
Yeah.
Particularly there are fellow citizens who are not Catholics.
Absolutely.
And the idea that my views should be imposed upon them is something that I simply don't go for. I simply don't. But I would hold on to my Catholic beliefs, and I would hope that those secular people or others would respect my beliefs as well, just as I respect theirs.
Absolutely, yeah, 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 yeah.
There's room for there's room for everybody, and don't ever forget, Jesus Christ was condemned to death for blasphemy. Blasphemy, believe it or not.
You would therefore be a strong advocate for separating church and state.
Yes, very much, very much, and because I think that it's what I would call it, when the throne and the altar come together like that, it's a suffocating embrace, and I think the church must stand on its own feet with its own believers, its own followers, and not to be, and church running the state and being involved intimately with the state, I have my reservations there all the time. And we've had, our record in this country has not been good in that area.
Yeah.
So,
But having said that, Father, there are many who would say that we fought in this country for many centuries for the right to an education, the right to use the Irish language, to speak the Irish language, and the right to actually practice our faith. So when at the foundation of the state, this Catholic religion was incredibly important to people who had been denied it for so long.
that is true. That is true.
And now we have people, that there are those who would say that it's being whipped from us again, and especially COVID situation, and not being able to go into a church and practice your faith, because it's one thing being able to look at mass on Facebook or watch it online. It's another thing to receive the sacraments, to receive the sacrament of communion, confession, and you can't do that unless you're physically in a church. And there are people who feel that the church is weakening in that it's not strong enough. It's not demanding that people be allowed to practice their faith, irrespective of what faith you follow, whether you're a Muslim or a Protestant or any denomination, that you should be able to practice your faith in the premises. And it seems like the church is letting some priests stand out in protest and try to do something about it, and standing back and not doing anything. I believe you actually are one of the latter priests that believes that the government is right to prevent masses at the moment for health and safety reasons. What is your view?
Yeah. Well, we're in an unfortunate situation, and I particularly think the funerals, that's one of the areas where this is most felt, where the numbers are very small, and I think people probably have felt that more than any other aspect. I did a wedding last week for six people, and they had 200 invited, but they couldn't, but they went ahead anyway. While I think it's unfortunate, and I spoke about this actually on Easter Sunday.
Yeah.
I think you may have come across some of my text for Easter Sunday, but I am happy to accept the advice of the medical and legal experts at the moment, like Dr. Houlihan and his friends. And if they advise me not to have religious services as we had them before, I'm happy for the moment to accept that. I think it's a short-term sacrifice. Hopefully in a couple of months it will be finished and we'll be back. But for the moment, I'm happy to accept it.
Do you not think that the goalpost has been moved so many times, and many people are getting frustrated because, I mean, for instance, you can go to a doctor, a hairdresser can go to her doctor, but the doctor can't go and get his hair done from the same hairdresser. The rules keep changing, and the churches and and the idea that we had recently here at the church in O'Connell Street, the Jesuits. It's run
Yes.
by French priests now. Recently, there was
Yes.
a group of people standing outside for the Tridentine Mass, and one councillor was hounding them, standing outside in the open air at safe distances, and she called the police on them and the Gardaí on them. And to me, there are no words for that woman that would be decent. And secondly, I mean, the Gardaí didn't want to do anything, quite frankly. But people should be, I'm a believer that people should be able to practice their faith. I mean, we have St. John's Cathedral, St. John's Cathedral would hold 1,000.
Yes.
And yet they can't have Mass on a Sunday. And it would never have a full house inside at Mass. But I do believe, that, and maybe you'll think I'm wrong in this, but I do believe that the fact that we've been deprived of being able to practice, to go into the church when we wanted to, people who may never have gone inside a church for years may be more inclined to go back after COVID, because it's been prevented from them for so long. What do you think about that, Father?
Well, I think it'll be the ban, if you like, will be short term. We're talking about maybe a month or two more, in which case hopefully we'll be back to normal. And I think in the overall, the bigger picture of things, and the enormous number of deaths and the enormous amount of sickness, that while we have made a sacrifice, financially too, by the way, it isn't a huge price. It isn't a huge price in the long term.
See, I disagree with you there. I disagree with you there, because I think, yes, maybe many people will survive this okay, but there's the long-term effect on people's mental and emotional well-being, their financial well-being. Many people will have lost their businesses, they'll have lost their homes, they'll have lost their family, they'll have lost their minds, and in some cases people will have lost their lives because they just don't. And you wonder which is, which is the lesser of the two?
Well, the difficulty is that just a year ago, this was all new to us. So we've been hit with something which we've never had before, in my lifetime anyway. And it's a colossal, the virus has been a colossal learning experience, a very steep learning curve. I mean, I'm amazed at how fast the vaccines have come through. I thought it would be years. They've moved very fast. And I appreciate the sacrifices that have been made. You just mentioned some of them there, businesses and hairdressers and bars and restaurants and everything.
But they're sacrifices that will never be, people will never recover from. I mean, the government isn't losing a penny. They're not losing a penny in wages. And if they were, perhaps we'd opened up a lot quicker. Dr. Houlihan isn't losing a penny by any of this. In fact, they've taken rises in their wages. Meanwhile, an average shop can't, or a hair salon, or a clothes shop, or a sweet shop can't open. And that's an awful lot to be expecting one group of people to sacrifice at the same time. And people, elderly, who had just their Mass to go to every morning, to sit inside quietly, maybe not speak to another person, but see them inside. I think looking at the royal wedding or the royal funeral the other day brought it home as well to me, that no matter who you are, watching the Queen sitting there on her own, head bowed, nobody allowed next to her to sit and even hold her hand. I thought it was immoral that a woman of 95 years of age should be left sitting alone without a solitary being comfort her while her husband of 75 years was being buried. And it's the same all over Ireland and all over, certainly all over Ireland. I don't agree with the sanctions. I think they're unrealistic to expect. What is it? How many? 30 to a funeral in
10,
Ireland?
actually.
10.
10?
10 to a funeral in Ireland. That's ludicrous. We're known for our funerals. They're social events in this country. And the church is the church should be, in my view, that priest in Cavan, he's been left hang out to dry.
Well, who I sympathise with here myself are the Garda, for example. I know that last thing on earth the Garda want to do is to be entering houses of worship, telling people to desist. I think they find it, it's the last thing they wish to do, and it's putting them in a most invidious position. But I'm also concerned, you mentioned the priest in Cavan, Father Hughes, I think is the name.
Yeah.
He, speaking about Oliver Cromwell, speaking about penal laws, I think that's emotive language, very pejorative terms, Oliver Cromwell and penal laws, and comparing Micheál Martin to Oliver Cromwell and Dr. Houlihan's directives to penal laws. I think that's emotive, and I think actually damages our case.
But there are many who would actually share his views that not since penal laws have people been prevented from actually congregating to celebrate their faith or to practice their faith.
So I presume, is your argument then, I not follow where you're going here, is your argument then that there should be no close down at all?
Well, I don't think that, personally, it's just a personal view. I don't see the logic of 10 at a funeral. I don't see the logic of people not being able to go into St. John's Cathedral and celebrate Mass when it wouldn't even be a fifth or an eighth full. I think it should be dependent on the size of the church per square meter, that people spread out inside in the church. And I'm sure the priests inside in Mass are quite capable of saying to people, you sit here and you sit here and you sit here, and keep people spaced out. But the idea that you cannot go into a church, it just seems to me counterproductive, and it's going to come back. I believe it's going to come back to haunt people later on, because people lose their trust. Gradually, people are starting to get disinterested in following these instructions. That's what I think, because you can do it for so long, and if you were told, it would be a year, and it'll be over on next year on a certain date. But the goalpost, what was to be 2 weeks, ends up nearly a year and a half, and there's no signs. And I just think that the church the church, for the most part, the bishops, the cardinals, they're not doing enough, I don't think, to actually say, look, GAA matches could be back. Rugby matches could be back. They could go into scrums, but a poor misfortunate old woman or old man can't go into Mass and sit in their own side of the church. There's no logic, in my view.
Hopefully it's a temporary little arrangement, I think, and hopefully within a few weeks we'll be back. That's the way I see it.
Well, hopefully, I just personally think that it's just going on way too long, and it's expecting too much of too many. But yet, the people who are making these rules are not subject to the same financial restrictions at all. If anything, they seem to have benefited. But on a more positive note, Father, you were in Drogheda, and it was in Drogheda that you were actually chastised for baptizing or allowing the father and mother to pour water over the child, and you
Yes.
were for it, but yet you received their highest honor, and it's a town of 40,000.
Yes.
It's
Well, when you say the highest honor, I take it you're referring to the freedom of the borough.
yeah, you
Freedom of
did.
the borough. I did. And the last churchman before me to get that was John Paul.
So you're
and
all
he did okay.
into their eyes.
In fact, I was somewhat flattered when I looked at the list. Charles Parnell, John Paul II, Eamon de Valera.
Oh, well.
Yes. So I was somewhat flattered.
You should about, and John Paul II, you should probably be absolutely flattered about as well. Yeah. But you're in Limerick. What are you in the Augustinians here in Limerick, Father?
No, I've actually left Limerick. I'm feathered in Tipperary now.
Yeah.
Feathered Tipperary.
Do you like it there?
Yeah, very quiet. I'm sort of, especially now in the lockdown, there's very little happening. I'm involved a bit in the school as well here, which I enjoy, and I dabble in the school, and I visit the Glen of Aherlow, and it's great. It's also a great horse country. I'm not a great horseman, but it's great horse country here.
Yeah.
And,
well, it is.
More Ballydoyle.
And with what's her name winning the Grand National the other day
yes, Rachel Blackmore. Rachel, yes.
I don't follow horse racing at all, but we interviewed Rachel here, and she was lovely. And I watched it as she was winning. Up to, I had no interest in horse racing, but it was just such a great joy for Munster, because it's a Limerick horse, a Waterford trainer, and a Tipperary jockey.
Yes. Well, I've often said that we have many here in this area of feathered. We have many, many millions worth of flesh. Equine, I mean.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. My grandfather, I told you off camera. My grandfather, my mother's mother, he was Patrick O'Dwyer from, I think, Tipperary town, but a friend of mine then. His granduncle was Dan Breen, my fight for Irish freedom.
Yes. Well, all I do know is that for our house in Aherlow for more than 40 years, Dan Breen always got the #1 vote. He would have given the Sacred Heart a run for his money in our house.
So instead of the John F. Kennedy photograph and the Sacred Heart, it was Dan Breen and the Sacred Heart.
Yes, Dan Breen was our #1 for many decades, all his life. Every #1 vote in the house went to him.
Yeah, but that's why when you look at people like that, like Dan Breen and Padraig Pearse and all of those who fought for independence of this country and fought for so much in this country, and you think that people are just sitting by and allowing us, not people who are wanting to go to mass. I mean, there's people, as I say, who didn't darken the door of a church, but now you hear them saying things like, that was different when you knew you could walk in at any stage. Now you know you can't, and you're being told not to. To be told not to do something is worse than actually making the choice yourself. And I think it's a stubbornness in the Irish. People who never wanted to go to mass now want to go because they're being told not to.
Well, I would think and I would hope it would be a temporary little arrangement, and that if people want to go back, they'll have their chance.
What made you decide to be a priest? What was it that drew you to the priesthood, and why are you have you found yourself at odds with a lot of the teachings of the church and the traditional teachings? Because I know you believe that the traditional church is, in your own words, all but gone. Do you really believe that?
Well, the traditional church that I grew up in is all but gone. I only look round me and I see it. And it doesn't mean the church is gone.
Yeah.
The particular model in which I grew up is largely dead, very largely dead. Now, what it will be replaced by, I'm not 100% sure, but I am one of those who strongly believes that Catholicism can be adapted to modernity. The basic truths of Catholicism don't change, namely the life, death, and resurrection of the Lord. That remains fixed. But the world in which it's preached is changing all the time. All the time. And we've got to move along with it, because the model out of which we have operated has worked for a while. It's finished now. Finishing.
But what again would you say to people who say that's like, and it's back to what I said earlier, that's like a mother and a father, a mother role, or that, and disciplinarian, or you have your rules, and the children know their boundaries, and know what they can do and what they can't do. That by bending so much and trying so much to be cool and modern, modernity isn't always the best. Sometimes people need to know our boundaries, and need to know. I mean, I'm not talking about being overly strict like the Catholic Church was, and certainly was. But now you go into Mass and you can take the communion in your hand, which
Yes.
was a sin before. It was a sin if you were trying to get the communion, if it was stuck to the roof of your mouth, you were there for the whole Mass trying to get it off with your tongue because you were afraid to put your hand in because it was a sin. And you go to Mass, and the prayers are the wording is being slightly changed, and you're all the time, and you're saying like, and I love the Tridental Mass, and I love the mystique. I'm into pomp and ceremony as a person. That's what I love about the royal family. I love the pomp, the ceremony. Philip's funeral the other day was just glorious to watch from the perspective of pomp and ceremony. And with the Tridentine Mass, the Gregorian chanting, the Latin, that okay, you don't know what's been said in Latin unless you actually understand Latin. But if you went to Germany and France and you went to Mass there, you'd be listening to it in German, and you'd be listening to it in French. You still don't understand it. Where as the Tridentine, in my view, becomes almost a universal language within the church, that I can't understand why it was taken away by, as you said, your hero, John the 23rd, who took away
John the 23rd.
Who took away the Latin Mass. And my mother used to grieve terribly. She used to say, what did John take away the Latin Mass for? We loved the Latin Mass. And I can see why she would, because in every country it was the same. It gave you time to meditate. It's almost like you listen to Judaic prayers, and you listen to the call to prayer in Islam, and you listen to the Tridentine. It's that meditative sound that gives you the time or the space to actually be at one with your own thoughts, even if you don't.
But my own belief is that it ought not to have been taken away. The new vernacular, bring it in by all means. But for those who wanted the Tridentine Latin Mass, I would have given them the option of having it.
Yeah.
In fact, I would have had both. Both.
Yeah, and that's why I think that church up there, the Jesuits, is becoming popular again. Okay, the young priests are doing so much to try and revitalize the Tridentine Mass, and it's just lovely and relaxing to listen to the chants, and to listen to the. My mom, when she was buried, her funeral, her Mass was in Irish, English, and Latin. and it was
Mhm.
it was Canon Willie Fitzmaurice who said the mass, and
Yes,
half of us were.
a very good hurler in his time.
That's what I was about to say. Half the lads were ex-hurlers or were hurlers, and
Yes.
they were. I didn't think Willie knew Latin, but that's the way she wanted it was. And many of them said afterwards that it was the first time they felt they had been at mass in a long time or ever, because they hadn't grown up with the Latin mass. They were my age, but they felt that they were at something different, something spiritual, because it sounded spiritual. It was a time they could actually just think and not have
Yeah.
to listen, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think there's room for both. And I, for one, would have welcomed the vernacular and the massive native in the language of the people. But for those who wanted the other, I wouldn't have taken it away from them. I believe that was an error. The choice
Yeah,
should have been left.
I think it was an error, but at least it's coming back. Um, uh, at least it's coming back. But you think that the church in its original form has to bend to the people, to the will of the people. Well,
Well,
I guess you'd be all for women priests.
I would. In that, I would. In that they would at least have done as good a job as I've done. And the half are, I think we're breathing in one lung, not having women priests. And I have no problem, really, I can't see what the difficulty is. And those who argue that Christ didn't ordain women,
Mm.
well, very quickly, anybody with a modicum of history will know that Christ was operating in the Judaic Roman world, which was a totally patriarchal society. And there's no way that he would have, in fact, Christ didn't ordain anybody. Christ was a Jew. And, but the idea that it could only be something done by a group of males exclusively for all time and forever, that's something I fail to understand. Simply fail to understand. And I think we're the loss is ours. The loss is ours, I do believe. I've said that for many years.
What would be your view? Well, again, there are people who would say, well, if you have married priests or you have women priests, and women are married and men are married and they go into the church. I know a lot of Anglican priests who converted at one stage,
Yes,
brought families with them, but Catholic
sure.
ordained Catholic priests like you cannot marry, which in my view is wrong. I mean, it should be one rule for one and one rule for all. Why should you not be allowed to marry, but yet somebody can bring their wife as an Anglican minister and can
Well,
convert
what it shows you then that it's
become a
purely
priest?
illegal. It's purely illegal. It's not a doctrinal matter.
But I mean,
There's no,
from a simple point of view, with me, they became Catholics. That's one thing, but they also became priests. They held on to their priesthood, even though it took you about 7 years to train as a priest.
yes,
And that to me is jars with me as somebody whose father's side of the family are entirely Protestant. My father's people were church being mostly all Methodist and Welsh Methodist. And but I think that how can somebody come in who is an Anglican priest and become a priest in the Catholic Church when it took you 7 years to become a priest? And he can bring his wife and children with him, but you can't marry.
yes. Well, it shows that as I said to you a moment ago, it shows that you're not dealing with a doctrinal matter. It's nothing to do with doctrine. It's purely a disciplinary matter, which could be changed tomorrow if the authorities so chose. So I see that as a relatively minor one compared to the women priests one.
But why is the church so reluctant to to move on women priests and to move on priests being married. Do you think it's for financial reasons that, I mean, if Father Iggy decided to get married in the morning, Father Iggy was, the church decided to move Father Iggy to um, uh, the deep, dark, as darkest places in the world, like Mongolia, out of Mongolia or someplace like that. Not so easy for a wife to be brought and children to be taken out of school logistically. There are people who would say that how can that happen? How can families function if a priest, by your nature, are constantly being moved from parish to parish, city to city, country to country, and the children?
It's a it's a real issue. But as I said, the important thing is that it's a cultural thing. It's something that grew up over for the first 1,000 years of the church. It didn't exist at all, except for monks and people of that sort. But when it did become mandatory, only in the Middle Ages, so we got on without it. We got on without it for 1,000 years. So it's not a major matter of theology or doctrine. In fact, it's irrelevant to those things. It's purely, but nevertheless, I think it's, especially talking to young people, I think our street credibility loses greatly on that particular score. Like they find it, at one time it was seen as a heroic sacrifice, or making sacrifices and so forth. I think many young people today would see it as a bit, quite frankly, a bit weird. Something not right.
But does that make it wrong? But that make it wrong? Because young people today think that it's not natural. I mean, people who would be members of an enclosed order of nuns would feel that it was absolutely the most natural thing in the world for them to.
Yes, but you see here, you're making one little error here. I think you must make a distinction between vowed religious. If tomorrow morning, the celibacy was abolished, it wouldn't in the slightest affect vowed religious like the Augustinians, like the Carmelites, like the enclosed nuns that you referred to. They would continue to be celibate. And the difference is where it is mandatory for the whole church.
Yes.
And that is the big difference. So therefore, the enclosed Carmelites or anybody else, it wouldn't affect them at all. They would continue as they are.
It's back to what you said about the Tridentine. Allow people the choice.
Yes. I think that's the key point. That is the key point.
If somebody wants to remain celibate, they'll remain celibate, or they'll join a celibate order. And
absolutely, yes. If they so wish.
Yeah.
If they so wish, yes, true. But
what was the journey?
I would have a choice there.
What was the journey?
Sorry?
There's a pause, you see, in us speaking. There's a delay on the signal. But what was your journey to priesthood? And have you had any regrets?
Oh, yeah. Like sometimes people ask me, if you were starting off again, would you do it again? Very hard to say. Like my initial interest in priesthood was actually to be an Augustinian missioner in Africa, and the missioners were seen as, if you like, the stormtroopers on the frontier. But I've never done that. I've spent much of my life in the academic world, actually.
Yeah.
Teacher of history and that type of stuff. And most of my life in Ireland, I did teach history in Rome for a few years. But my initial spur, and it would have been quite common in my childhood, and young people around me, missioners, Irish missioners, were seen as heroes. Today, what Irish missioners got up to and the type of church they brought to Africa and Asia and so forth is much more questioned. Much more questioned. And whereas what would have been seen as the stormtroopers on the frontier are now very much seen as brought a European model of church, and maybe, in fact, in the long term, may have done damage. It's seen differently now. But your motivation for remaining as a priest changes as time goes on. Like what initially attracted me wouldn't attract me today at all, in any sense of that term.
What initially attracted you?
Possibly the whole idea of mission, I think, going to the missions. That was one. That was almost definite. And the idea of being an Augustinian missionary, that was the attraction when I was 13 or 14. It most certainly wouldn't attract me now. No way. No. And but I suppose I'd say one thing. One thing for the Augustinian.
Would you have regrets to the point that you would say to yourself, if I had my time back again, I wouldn't have been a priest?
There are times you would say that, but then if you had chosen any career, you'd probably be saying that too.
Yeah.
What was I doing all my life as a guard sergeant, or as a,
Yeah, at least you'd have had more options, Father. At least you'd have been able to marry and to have children. You gave up a lot to become a priest and to become a missionary priest that you didn't end up becoming. Life took you in a different direction.
Yes.
Do you think it would be easier for priests to remain priests and remain true to their priesthood if they were allowed to marry?
Some of them, yes. Like many of the ones I know that have left, by and large, they have left to marry. And the pity, I think, is that some of them are probably the people of greatest initiative and ability.
Yeah.
That is, I think, it's an enormous loss to the church. And in fact, there's a very good case for the very large number of married priests out there to allow them to resume their ministry if they wanted to, especially at a time when the number of vocations is very small, and you simply look around you. By and large, your very next few years are going to be heading many more empty churches, many more.
And especially
that's staring us straight in the face.
I grew up listening to my mother saying, once a priest, always a priest. She always had that saying that even if a priest priesthood, because he was ordained, he was a priest for life. And even married, he was a priest, he was still a priest for life. So that is what you just said about there being an opening for allowing married priests to still perform their priestly duties and still celebrate Mass because they were ordained, and irrespective of whether they got married or had a relationship afterwards, they were still ordained priests.
Yeah. And besides, it happens to be a fact that in certain parts of the world, particularly through Latin America, Mexico, and that, which is the biggest Catholic area in the world, that the number of priests there who are in relationships is probably in the great majority.
Really?
Yes. Yes. And life goes on.
What do you think?
I'm told the figure might be as high as 70%, I'm told.
Wow. And how does that actually sit with the likes of priests, say here in Ireland, who see that happening, and see the Protestants, say the Church of Ireland ministers coming and bringing their wives and children?
Yes.
How does that sit with priests?
Oh, I have no doubt. I have no doubt for some of them it's demoralizing. For some of them it's demoralizing, but it happens to be a fact. And I have known this for decades. Even when I was in my formation in Rome, some of my colleagues from Brazil and Mexico and that often told me that. Often.
And still you went forward.
I did, yes, I did. But perhaps I'm a person of very little imagination.
I doubt that very much. I'd say you were one of these people who was a very deep thinker, who thought a very philosophical thinker. I'd say you weren't somebody who accept. I'm a bit like that, who rails against conformity, and doesn't like to be told what to do, and is able to think for themselves. And I'd say you were very much
Well,
single.
I did my younger days. I did spend a few years in UCD, and I remember being the same time as one lad I got on well with, actually, who went on to become a well-known writer later, Roddy Doyle.
Oh, right. Oh, wow.
The same year, and Fintan O'Toole. And I remember being in the Council for Civil Liberties and things like that with those people, and they were amazed that I had anything to do with the church. But so therefore, I picked up some of my ideas along the way there, and I was trained as a historian, which is something I have never quite dropped.
Yeah. Yeah, but don't you think when you train as a historian, my PhD was English literature, but it was historical literature. Don't you think you become this critical thinker, and you're trained in critical thought and
Yes,
analysis, and it never leaves you. You could argue that it's a form of paranoia, because you can never accept what's written. It's like Derrida that says there's no truth in anything that's written, because everything that's written can be reinterpreted, and every reading of a text can be different with every reading, even if
absolutely.
it's different each time you read it and you see something else. So there's
Yes,
no truth in any text.
yes, and that is particularly true of the scripture.
Yeah.
That the way we read it today is very different to the way it was read 100 years ago. Today
And with
we have
every,
I
and with
have what I call historical critical approach, which, if you like, it makes it wear a hair shirt. It doesn't wear it comfortably.
yeah. I understand. Do you find it difficult now with the scandals that's been in the priesthood, and that does it sit badly with you?
It does. It does. Well, what it has done is it has demythologized a great deal about the priesthood. That, like, we were on a moral, if you like, a moral pedestal. Now we find that many of these great heroes of ours had feet of clay, or worse, and we're paying a price for that now.
What do you
And
think that?
particularly in this country, where the Irish Church was a model of anti-sexual terrorism. The Irish Church particularly. The others weren't, the Italians and all wasn't as bad. We were. And then to be found ourselves, if you like, with our hand in the accountant with his hand in the till, so to speak.
As an historian, why do you think that was so prevalent, say, in the Irish Catholic Church as opposed to any other? What is it about the Irish Church that made that so prevalent? Was it society? Was it the?
It was society, it was culture, the post-famine Ireland, where
Was it the sense of power they were given? The priests suddenly had, after having nothing. They grew up with, after the famine, before the famine, all that era, with nothing. Suddenly they were running the country. Suddenly they were omnipotent. Suddenly they had this sense of.
they were, and I suppose one can't overgeneralize.
Yes.
We had, if you like, Victorian morality mixed with Roman rules and regulations, and when the two came together, it was a lethal cocktail. That's
Yeah.
what it is. Victorian morality particularly the Roman rules and regulations, which the Romans themselves didn't take very seriously, but we did. We applied a Victorian morality to it. And, for example, we take censorship in this country. Censorship. of literature. It was the list of banned books was almost an index to the world's great literature.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah, but it's also happening today, Father. I mean, if you look to the States and you see books like Little House on the Prairie and Gone with the Wind and all of these great books, and Bean, or they're looking to erase history by burning the books, getting rid of the books, refusing to allow. I personally feel that everything should be read, but read in context and read within classrooms and used as discussions about what it was like, say, for instance, for the Catholic Church in 1845 or 1916, or what it was like, say, in America in the South in the 1800s. You know, it's we can't wipe history out by trying to remove the books. It still happened.
Yeah.
We can ignore it all we like and pretend it didn't happen and live in a bubble, but that only makes us ignorant. That, you know, we're never going to learn about racism, about intolerance, about injustice within the Catholic Church unless we actually read and find out why people thought like that, why society was like that.
Yeah, but anyway, there we are. And look, I have to go now. And look, it's been good to talk to you, Mary. And hopefully you got something from it.
I got lots from it, Father. You're an inspiration. Okay. You're an absolute,
Okay.
Thank you, Father, for chatting with me today. It was an absolute pleasure. And
okay.
Up Tipperary.
Okay, God bless.
That's the end of the show for today. Until the next time, Lacuna of Day. Walam tu galer chiacana, sonas agus gra, agus gadei shifslon.